Welcome to the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires. This episode, we have IMSA President Scott Atherton as my guest. We sat down at the recent Porsche Rennsport reunion at WeatherTech Raceway Laguna Seca to talk about Don Panoz. Our dear friend Don Panoz, who we recently lost. Scott spent more than a decade of his life as Don's number two, running so many things for him. Everything from the American Le Mans Series to Elan and all the racing businesses, the car businesses, the manufacturing, you name it. And we had intended to do this at Petit Le Mans. Obviously, you might have heard I've had to cancel all travel for the rest of the year to look after some far more important things at home with family. And so knowing that I wouldn't be able to do this at Road Atlanta with Scott as planned, we sat down in the media center in Monterey and just listened to him share some tales. And there are some gems in here, some real gems. Heavy hearts though, but we do manage to have some fun too. I won't spoil it, but his Don Panoz sandwich story, boy, that was a real highlight among many other things that we discussed. And Scott, I know, is someone who will continue to grieve, and many of us will continue to miss Don. Just a really big heart, big character, brought so many cool things to our sport. And so if nothing else, just sitting down and spending some time talking about Don's life and all the neat things that he's done, wanted to make sure that we did that leading into the event that is really the defining thing that Don created for us. And then not only Petit Le Mans kicking off back in '98, but then the American Le Mans Series, which followed, and so many other amazing things. So thanks to Scott for sitting down. We did, of course, do our best to get quiet space to do this, but as you might have heard me mention in one or two other podcasts recently, the new media center in Monterey is possibly the loudest thing ever. And there are also some press conferences going on behind where they had their speakers turned way up so everybody, even in the hills, could hear. So did our best here to try and shield ourselves and have a conversation, but also apologize a little bit because we didn't exactly have a soundproof booth to do it. But nonetheless, some tales about Don with Scott Atherton, the man who really made so many of Don's dreams and desires come to reality. You know, you can get every episode of the Marshall Pruett podcast on iTunes, on Podbean, on Spotify, Google Play. We have our Marshall Pruett podcast Facebook page where you can sign up and get everything the minute that it posts. And with all that said, let's get going here with Scott Atherton in a conversation about the life of Don Panoz. Mr. Atherton, we are, I'd almost say, in a funk. I know I am. I know you are. And yep. I know those who loved Don Panoz, those who maybe didn't know him, but were inspired by Batmobiles and Sparkies and Delta Wings and G-Forces and you name it. Sometimes it's hard to grasp what we've lost without fully appreciating what made us love him and what he did while he was here. And I know that you were as close to, if not his number one general.
Yeah, for 14 years, I would agree with you. On the motorsports side, for sure. There was so much more to Don than motorsports, but that's what makes him near and dear to you and I and many, many others.
I figure it might be just interesting for folks who certainly did not know Don as well as you did, just to hear some thoughts, some appreciations about him, about the man, about some of his achievements. For me, I don't actually know where you guys met, how you guys came together. So maybe that's a great place to start, just to hear about how the two of you became a tag team.
It is kind of a fun story. And at the time, I was the president and general manager of California Speedway. And I had moved there from Nazareth, Pennsylvania, as part of the Penske Motorsports Group, which at the time was a New York Stock Exchange public company.
Yeah.
And California Speedway had just opened, so it was a big job, big responsibility. Bill France Jr. pulled me aside and said, "You are our future," because, and not meaning me personally, but California Speedway. And so it was high stress and lots of expectations. Penske Motorsports was acquired by International Speedway Corporation. That was a different management approach, different style. I was happy, but had I would say for the first time, a wandering eye from a career standpoint. And out of the blue one day comes a phone call from Ralph Sanchez. And Ralph Sanchez I had known because we were both IndyCar promoters and had attended a lot of the same meetings, and I had gotten friendly with him while he was building Homestead and had been able to spend some time with him separately, and we knew each other through that. And so out of the blue comes a phone call from Ralph, which was very much unusual, not the type of person. We didn't have the relationship that we were talking on a regular basis, but not beating around the bush in the call. He says, "I got a question for you. Have you ever heard of a guy named Don Panoz?" And I had, but only just that, because I was a fan of sports car racing, always had been. So I kept track of what was happening in the industry, and I knew that it was in a bad place. The sports car racing at the time was completely fragmented. Many would say it was in its darkest hours. And Ralph went on to describe what Don had going on, that he had created this event called Petit Le Mans, and out of that had started a new sports car championship called the American Le Mans Series, that he'd acquired Sebring International Raceway, Road Atlanta, Mosport up in Canada, that he was in the process of acquiring G-Force to build Indy cars for the IRL. And he was, I believe Van Diemen had already been acquired, so he was building Formula Fords and small entry-level open wheel and sports cars, and it was just went on. And he says that the problem, Scott, is this guy doesn't have any experience in this industry, and he has absolutely no one running it. And he's going a mile a minute, and if you would have any interest at all in talking to him, let me know. So, as I said, for the first time, I had a bit of a wandering eye, and I said, yeah, I'd be interested in talking to him. So next time I'm in the East, I'll see if we can figure out a way to get together. And that happened relatively quickly. It was probably a few weeks after that first phone call. And Don, I was in Florida, and Don was living at the time in, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia. And he invited me to come to his home and picked me up at the Savannah airport in one of the Panoz Roadster. so not the Esperante that everybody knows, but the aluminum intensive vehicle, the AIV, the Panoz AIV, and which is a go-kart on steroids. And I've got my briefcase and my luggage, and I'm suit and tie, and we go flying through the streets of Savannah, Georgia, and we end up at this beautiful, elegant, period-correct, fully restored home in the historic district of Savannah. Giant wraparound porch and immaculate gardens, and
that's painting. That has to be. Setting the stage. You had to walk in and realize that this is different, but this is also seems somewhat otherworldly or amazing.
Yes, all of the above. And I'd done a little homework in the meantime to understand exactly what Don was up to and his background, and I understood his pharmaceutical history and had very little knowledge of his motorsports other than what Ralph had shared. There wasn't much to research about it back in those times. This is 1999 we're talking about, 98, 99. I want to say 99. So we ended up sitting out on that porch, had dinner, and drank iced tea until the wee hours of the morning. And, of course, Don smoking a cigarette. I was strictly iced tea. And we talked about all of his plans and his visions and his racetracks and his race car manufacturing and all the other things that he had in play and the vision that he had for it. And he says, I've got my plane here. If your schedule works, let's go tour around tomorrow, and we'll, rather than just describe it, let's go see it.
Wow.
Okay. So ring up the pilots and get on board the Challenger 600 next morning, and we fly to Canada. And we tour most sports and meet Miles Brandt, the general manager that's been there forever, and finished up there and back on the plane and flew to Atlanta and did the same thing at Road Atlanta. And back on the plane and ended up going to Sebring. And then I think he dropped me off in Orlando, and it was one of those whirlwind tours, and the whole time we're talking a mile a minute, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And when I left him, I felt like, this is just nothing short of remarkable, what he has going on here. And I can't believe there's no infrastructure to look after any of this. But what an opportunity. And, there was no job offer at that time, and it was like, you'll hear from me. I really have enjoyed the day, and we kind of parted company with mutually expressing how much we had enjoyed the time together. And I went back to California, and Don went off to wherever he was going, and then weeks went by with no communication, none. So I'm thinking, well, that was short-lived. And then out of the blue again, here comes a phone call, and it's, okay, here's the deal. You're going to be president of Panoz Motorsports Group, and we're going to structure it like this, and these are the details, and I need you there tomorrow. Sooner the better. And it was a fast track from that moment on. I resigned from California Speedway, and which I think to this moment is, I think the first sitting president of a ISC facility that voluntarily stepped down, which created a bit of a rumble within the company.
Sure.
The vice president of HR was on the plane the next day to Southern California saying, what in the heck is going on? Explain to me again, where are you going? What are you doing? And, when I explained to them the opportunity, it was, oh, okay, well, good luck with that. And those early days were, you can't accurately describe it because there were no employees. We had all of those examples that I just rattled off. Don owned them. They were his. And yet each entity had somewhat of a management structure around that entity, but nobody looking after the sum of the parts. And so employee number one, and I remember distinctly because it was this empty office with not even a desk. There was a chair and a card table. And later that day, a phone showed up, and later that week a computer showed up, and bit by bit, piece by piece, we started assembling what ultimately became Panoz Motorsports Group, a proper parent company that was looking after the racetracks, the American Le Mans Series, the European Le Mans Series, the Asia Pacific Le Mans Series, G-Force, Van Diemen, Elan Composites, Elan Precision Engineering, Elan Power. I think at one point there was 13 separate divisions that all rolled up to Panoz Motorsports Group, but as I say, you can't put into words the early days and the total chaos that reigned 24/7.
So when I think of that time and I think of you, and we didn't know each other, but just from reading, at that time and also retroactively, we know that Don had unquenchable curiosity and desire. That's cool. I want to do it. Let's do. Someone who wants all the toys in the store. Might not have been all the layers to make sure those toys were taken care of, properly maintained, etc. Tell me about being entrusted with turning this card table and a chair into what would eventually become a proper empire. But what was it like working for someone who's certainly has the money to put behind those wishes, but I have to believe that childlike curiosity and let's do everything, that had to give you a great amount of energy, maybe some headaches. What was it like working for Don?
Lots of headaches, lots of challenges, lots of rewards, and tremendous satisfaction. But Don, I've said this before and I'll say it again, Don's biggest strength, ironically, was also a significant weakness. And that is that he would take a meeting with anybody on any topic. There was very little, if any, barrier to access. So that combination means that he was exposed to a lot of crazy ideas and people that probably had nefarious intent. But it also means that Don was made aware of and got exposure to opportunities that other people shunned or didn't have time for, whatever it was. And Don many times was the product of the last person he had spoken to. And I think if there was a significant role that I played during the entire time that I was with him was to act as the buffer, the filter, as it related to motorsports. And as you well know, there's some characters in this industry, and not everybody has honorable intent.
Yes.
Tremendous amount of money that comes in and out of this sport. And I would say in those early days, I was under the microscope, not so much from Don, but from some of the other people that he had surrounding his core business. And the core business at the time was the resorts and the real estate. That, Don had retired from the pharmaceutical industry. He had Chateau Elan, which was the hotel, the winery, the golf courses, and also very significant real estate developments taking place. And those folks had experienced enough bad examples of people from the motorsports industry coming in, and let's call it what it is, taking advantage of Don's naivete and just not knowing what he didn't know. And I'm sure they saw me as just the latest example of that. And, brace yourself, here we go again. So it was quite a long gestation period to gain their trust that I'm not here to take advantage of anybody. I'm here to build a real business around all of this infrastructure that's in place in terms of the individual components. But we need a management structure around it, and we need some fundamental business practices to be deployed here to make this a sustainable business. Now, my history leading up to that, working 9 years for Domino's Pizza Corporation, several years with Penske Motorsports, and most recently with International Speedway Corporation. That's some buttoned-down operations there. So if you come out of that mindset and with the knowledge of the structure and the management principles in place, and then you go to the polar opposite, and Don most often was just get it done. I don't care what you do, just get it done. And that can be taken many different ways.
Sure.
And as I say, the early days did not have a lot of structure around it. We were running wide open on the throttle. We were on the rev limiter, trying to primarily build out the startup of the American Le Mans Series, but also at the same time redeveloping the racetracks that were in mostly significant disrepair, a lot of deferred maintenance, a lot of just basic safety issues that had to be addressed.
Sure.
But the biggest challenge at that time was the American Le Mans Series, for sure. It was losing a tremendous amount of money. The early years of the ALMS were a test like no other of Don's stick-to-itiveness and the commitment that he had to stay the course. Because I would say anyone other than Don would have checked out much earlier, in the process, because they would have seen good money going after bad, and you couldn't see the end of the tunnel. It was that deep, and there was that many challenges, and Don had put some things in place long before I arrived. When you say long, he'd only been at it about a year when I came onto the scene there. But there was some long-term commitments that he'd signed up for that were financially very burdensome. And as I say, the challenge with Don most often was being able to get those resources freed up. We both knew what had to be done. And if you needed $1, Don would say, okay, I'm going to give you 75 cents, and you figure out the rest. And he said, well, no, Don, we need $1. If we don't have $1, this is not going to work. Well, I've only got 75 cents, so it's up to you. Get creative, Scott. Get creative. Now, the numbers were much, much, much bigger.
Of course.
And if you miss it by 25%, that's a big miss.
Can you share some stories about Don from that era in trying to take this amazing idea of bridging United States endurance racing, European/French endurance racing, something that was previously united, been many years though, but trying to restore that, infuse American pride into this American product, create this for the fans ethos that meant something. I have to imagine, on top of tasking you with making all these things a success, that you might have some stories about Don also wanting to get in there and help push things along or clear things out somehow.
Yeah, there's so many stories. The challenge is trying to, pick a couple. I think I'm better to describe his style, and you're right. He went to Le Mans and fell in love and immediately saw the opportunity that no one else had ever seen of importing the brand and importing the rule book to create, at first, a single event. And at the time, sports car racing, as I said, was in its darkest hours. The manufacturers had, for the most part, left the equation. Sponsors had left. There was a core group of fans that were hanging on by a thread.
Yeah.
He was frustrated because at the time he was just a team owner. Had no vision to be a sanctioning body or a racing series operator. He was out there racing as a team, trying to build a brand around the Panoz road car, and saw the opportunity to import the Le Mans brand and rule book and create that first event, Petit Le Mans, which was a unqualified success. Everybody that was a part of it came away saying, Don, you can't stop with one event. We've got to create something bigger. This needs to be a whole series based around the same vision, the same principles. So that meant a visit back to the ACO. At the time, the president of the ACO was Michel Casson, and Alain Berthaud was the head of all things technical and competition. Some really tough guys. Gerard Gachet was kind of the intermediary. He was the good English speaker, but very, very difficult because Don was trying to do something that had not been done before. So there was no pathway to follow. There was no ability to you were making it up as you went. Don's constant sense of humor and his ability to take the fight out of the equation was a critical element of those early days because they all understood English well enough to understand humor. And as anybody that spent any amount of time with Don, he was a frustrated stand-up comedian. And he always had a pocket full of jokes. And there would be key words that would come up. You'd be in an intense meeting, heavy negotiation, you're up on the edge of your seat, you're really, hammering away at whatever topic it was, and somebody would say something that would trigger in Don's mind a joke that would completely deflate the situation because we all had to take a time out.
Yeah, take a beat.
Enjoy the joke, and nobody laughed harder than Don, but it would.
There was a Dangerfield-esque element to Rodney. There was. I think that's one. It's great you mentioned that. I'd never really thought of it in that context, but yeah, there was that. For someone who was so amazingly proficient at innovation, business, heady things where you can spend your life just between your ears, to then also have that comedic ability and to know the timing and placement where it served best in a business setting, negotiations. Yeah, I've never appreciated that until you stated it that way.
Don's social skills were as adept as his entrepreneurial business skills, and his ability to separate the two. Very easily said, much more difficult to actually achieve, in that you could be at odds with somebody during the day and really at each other's throats over a major topic that had far-reaching implications, and then get together that night. And Don prided himself on his cooking ability as well. If he invited you to make his pasta with his spaghetti sauce, you had cleared the final gate of embrace. You were on the inner sanctum. And I can remember him cooking for the ACO. I can remember him cooking with Dr. Ulrich, going over to his house, and these are arch rivals that are racing against each other on the track, and it's not rare that there's issues that arise between factory programs and sanctioning bodies that have people at odds. And yet, you spend the evening in absolute social bliss with Don rattling the pans, making his spaghetti sauce, and lots of wine, and, of course, lots of cigarettes for him. But that was just how he operated. And
very much a gentleman. I mean, that's a gentlemanly mindset and approach. We're competitors. I can't wait till tomorrow to beat the living heck out of you. But guess what? We should still be friends. And we should be able to have dinner and celebrate one another and then go beat up on each other.
Absolutely true. You just captured it. And it wasn't an isolated one-off. It was never done for the show. It wasn't, media wasn't invited to witness this. This was very much on a personal level. Now, having said that, Don could also be the most acerbic, nasty, angry, aggressive individual you'd ever want to come across. He had a fighting spirit in him that was both literal as well as figurative, in that I've seen him get aggressive physically if he felt things weren't going the way they should. And more than once, hey, Don, take a breath, tap the brakes. And that's just the emotion of, I think it's an entrepreneurial spirit. But those examples were few and far between, and not what sticks out in my memory. There's so many positives, such a philanthropic, he and his family, wife Nancy, again, very quiet, not a lot of fanfare, no press releases issued, but tremendous support.
You hear the little stories come out about, again, quietly within the family of a person had a need, that need was satisfied, no questions asked. Yeah,
exactly. And it went far beyond just the writing of a check, because of Don's linkage to the medical industry through his pharmaceutical accomplishments. He had access to things, and even in his post-pharmaceutical career, he was on many boards and had access to experimental treatments and programs. And if you were a friend of Don's and you were suffering, he was your best advocate. And Ralph Sanchez, actually, I'm convinced that Don is responsible for adding several years of life to Ralph's life because of some programs and some opportunities that he made available to him. Again, very probably violating some personal confidences there, but that's just how he operated.
Understood. So, Scott, one of the things about Don that I know will stand every test of time is that he brought so many amazing motor racing vehicles into the world that years later, decades later, many of us still have models of Batmobiles and all kinds of things. Many of them non-traditional, not all. What was it like working with someone who conventional was a swear word? That had to be interesting, fun, I don't know.
Challenging. On the technical side, I had some insulation because there were team managers and engineers and people that were running the manufacturing side of our businesses that were the front line for those conversations. And Don, he was a frustrated aerodynamicist. He was a frustrated mechanical engineer. He was a frustrated design engineer. I mean, you name it, he had an opinion and had an idea. And the one example that I was directly a part of was the Delta Wing. And Don was not an early adopter. When he first saw the example, because it didn't exist when it came to us, Al Spire called me one day and said, look, have you read about, and are you familiar with this delta wing concept? IndyCar just voted no. So it's dead in the water. And this is Al Spire speaking. He says, I truly believe in this thing. We are prepared to get behind it. Do you think there'd be any application of this, in sports car racing? Now, this was a potential replacement for an open-wheel IndyCar, so you wouldn't see an obvious connection to sports car racing from that being the starting point. And Al introduced me to the engineering group that was behind it and the brain trust, which at the time was coming out of Chip Ganassi's organization. And my first question was, could this be configured in a sports car form? In other words, like an open cockpit prototype, such that there'd be place for two. And he said, yeah, absolutely. That's easily done. In fact, we could mock something up, computer, generated graphic type thing, and demonstrate that. I said, well, it's worth looking into, because this is when we were pursuing alternative fuels, alternative powertrains. We had Audi running on zero sulfur clean diesel. We had the Corvettes racing on cellulosic E85. We had Porsche coming with a flywheel hybrid. We had early examples of hybridization in other prototypes. And here's this radical approach. Half the horsepower, half the weight, half everything except all of the performance. So I met with the group at first, and they had done a computer simulation of what the car could look like in a sports car form, open cockpit, and which was basically what prototypes looked like at that time. The closed cockpit that we all know and love today was the exception, not the rule back then.
Sure.
So there was enough there that I was intrigued and approached Don to say, look, I think this is something you might be interested in. It's far enough out there that I think it's worth your time and consideration. And the first exchange, the first meeting, the first view that he had of all this, he was very dismissive. That's crazy. That makes no sense to me. This has no future.
Yeah.
And then, okay, I went and approached the ACO and said, do you think this would be, and we formally organized a meeting. It was, I think, connected to Petit Le Mans, so they were all in town anyway. And we had, Chip and his people and the ACO, and I think Don was in the room as well, and suggesting that potentially this is a Garage 56 entry. Is this technology enough out there? Half the horsepower, half the fuel, half the weight, all the performance. Does it make sense? And, the French said, maybe. No commitment, but why not? That's the famous response, why not? Which really isn't an answer, but it gives you encouragement to keep going.
It's not a no.
Yeah. And long story short, I don't know what the trigger point was, but at some point the light bulb went off with Don to say, you know what, I think there's something here. This Delta Wing has a future. And once he embraces something, it's all in. And that's exactly what went down. Duncan Dayton was a part of that. Firestone was a part of it in the early days. Chip Ganassi was a part of it, and some other investors got involved. And the resources put up to create the car, to go from concept and a lot of CAD drawings to an actual finished operating race car, which ironically was very much involved with All-American Racers, Dan Gurney and his group. It was a tremendous undertaking, but it gave us, in the American Le Mans Series, something to work with in terms of new content and a storyline that was unprecedented. And, of course, the car did go to Le Mans. It did compete in the Garage 56 category, and but for an unfortunate incident with a traditional prototype, who knows? It certainly had the pace and had the ability to play well, and ultimately did within the American Le Mans Series. And then even after the merger, it was somewhat grandfathered in and proved to be a a very effective combination of technology and innovation. And it wouldn't exist without Don.
I still find it brilliant, though, that the man who spat in the face of normalcy thought the Delta Wing initially was a little bit of a bridge too far, though. So there were limits, obviously came around. But there was also a spirit about Don that I loved. But I know, having read so many things from fans in the last week or two, they definitely felt it. And that was, he might be a quadrillionaire. He might have all the earthly possessions one could ever dream of having. He is also the guy who was standing out in the fence during the session watching the cars because he loved them. And not just in isolation, not with a wall of bodyguards around him.
Yep.
The one turning to the guy next to him, hey, which car do you like the most?
Yep.
Hey, which one's the best looking? Which sound do you like? The fact that Don was, on the surface, one of the world's most fortunate folks, yet if you didn't know his name and didn't know what he looked like and you were at an American Le Mans series or even an IMSA race, you might think it was just this nice old gentleman who was a race fan. Can you share some of that aspect of Don, that he was one of us? He wasn't walled off in a separate life in the world, life in the sky.
Don was a study of juxtaposition and opposing opposites in the category you just described. Because you're right, he was a very, very wealthy man. Had tremendous good fortune in many examples of pharmaceuticals, real estate, resorts, you name it, and ultimately motorsports as well. But the real money, as he would say and as his people would describe, came out of the pharmaceutical era. And he had some of the trappings that you would expect someone of that level of wealth to have. And I would say the big differentiator was a private aircraft that would, and Don used it as a business tool. I don't know of a personal trip that didn't have a business angle, business agenda attached to it on that jet. There were no trips to Las Vegas, Palm Springs, Hawaii. Never.
Wow.
It was purpose business. But here's the paradox. Here's the opposite. You've got a private jet with private pilots and all of the trappings that go with such a piece of equipment. And the morning catering was Egg McMuffins in a paper bag. And I'm not exaggerating. Every time. And we'd be in the FBOs, the fixed-based operation, which is, the terminal, so to speak, for private aircraft. And everybody's loading up their catering, which is, you name it. It's always very good. It's always very nice. It's always very expensive. And here would come Don's pilots with a bag of Egg McMuffins. Now, if lunch was to be served, there was a separate paper bag that was from Kroger or Safeway or whatever the local grocery store was. And inside that bag was a loaf of white bread, a package of bologna, and a squeeze bottle of mustard. And that was lunch. And Don's philosophy was, the finest meal you can have at 30,000 feet will be third rate compared to what we can have when we get back on the ground. So let's keep our powder dry. Let's save our money. We're going to have bologna sandwiches up here on our way, but I promise you tonight we're going to have a great dinner. And he always delivered. But that was the running joke is, private jets typically operate by the hour, so you're spending thousands and thousands of dollars to travel across the country wherever we were headed at the time. But we were saving on the catering.
I can only imagine the possible reaction if we're talking business trips, if he's on that jet with whichever captain of industry or some, I can only imagine the reaction they would have, but also the message it would send too. Yes, you might be flying within this amazing creation that has more zeros at the end of it than you can count.
Yep.
But guess what? At the heart of this, bread, mustard, bologna. This is as lunch pail as you can get.
That's exactly right.
That's brilliant. I didn't know that.
Yeah, all true. And the other examples that are even more broad-based is, Don would negotiate for the last dollar, and aggressively. We're not going to leave a dollar on the table here.
Wow.
But I was a part of some very large transactions, at least by my measure, large transactions, and not one of those affected his lifestyle one iota. It just, for most people, 99 point whatever percent of the population, it would have been a life-changing moment. And in Don's structure and that of his family, it had zero impact. He wasn't going to spend any more money on a house or a car or clothes or travel. It just was immaterial. But it was more of the sport of getting that last dollar out of every transaction that, was his driver. From a wealth standpoint, there were examples that would make him consistent with people of money. And I'll give you one funny story. We were on the floor of the Detroit Auto Show, and the Audi A8 was just making its debut. So this beautiful sedan, and it was an A8L, so it was an extended length sedan that was absolutely stunning. And it was, as you would expect it, as the showpiece of their display at the Detroit Auto Show. And Don said, he was talking, I forget who it was at the time, but the president of Audi North America, and he said, I'll take it. And he said, oh, great, Don, we'll love to have you drive one of our cars, and I'll make sure we get somebody in your area in Atlanta, and we'll sit down with you, and you can pick out, no, I want this one. Well, Don, this one's not for sale. He says, oh, yeah. I'm sure it will be at some point, and when it is, it's mine.
Wow.
And, what's the number? He says, well, the sticker's in the window, and send it to me. Send me the bill. I want the car. And about a month later, a car carrier, truck, trailer combination showed up and unloaded the Audi. And here's the funnier part of that story. It had this brand new interactive video screen that all of the functions of the car were handled with a joystick wheel, so that to turn the radio on and to select the band and select the station, it was, by today's standards, it was common, but at that moment it was a complete departure from the push-button preset stations, the sports station, the news talk, the traffic, the music. And Don was completely frustrated by it. You'd get in the car and the radio would be at absolute full volume, and he couldn't figure out how to turn it down. And that moment of sheer terror, like, oh my God, what do we do?
This thing's trying to kill me.
Yeah. And I just want to turn the windshield wipers on, or I want to turn the AC down. This confounded system. So long story short, he walks into my office one morning, like 3 weeks after taking delivery of this car. He says, I don't want this anymore. I'm going back to my old one. It's yours. So I'm driving this brand new state-of-the-art Audi A8. I had absolutely no business being in a car of that profile.
Wow.
But, Don's frustration with not being able to tune the radio delivered that car to me.
Oh, that's brilliant. Scott, what were some of the things that you saw made Don the happiest? I assume that many and all the things that he did fed his soul, made him just energized to wake up. But I don't know if that's the case. But what were some of the things that you saw, even after all the hard work put in, whether it was a series, an auto constructor, all the different things that went on? What things did you see that made him light up?
In motorsports, it was the thrill and the adrenaline of competition. And whenever his teams that were created in his vision, that were competing with cars that he was personally responsible for their creation and the operation and just the hands-on level that he brought to his racing, whenever there would be a victory, and in the early days of the LMP1, on those rare opportunities that they were able to beat the Audis, it was the most rewarding, the happiest, the most fulfilled you could imagine.
And the Washington, D.C. event is still spoken of as if it was a holy occurrence.
No question. And I was fortunate to be there and witness that, and it was nothing short of moving beyond any other description you could come up with, and the thrill that Don took away from that. The other one that Don always cited as being his most satisfying moment was beating Audi on their home track in Germany in the rain. And that victory came before the Washington, D.C. victory occurred. And the fact that the American-based team went to Germany and raced straight up with Audi on, home court advantage, so to speak, and beat them was... He ranked that actually above the Washington, D.C. event.
Wow.
And then when the GT car, I think it was Robin Liddell, had the first win in the Esperante. And ironically, it was at the second. We used to occasionally have 2 ALMS races. Whenever we needed more content on our calendar, we'd plug in a second Road Atlanta event. And I think Robin in that second event generated the first win in the Esperante. Huge satisfaction, because that was the Panoz road car in its racing format, beating the likes of Porsche and Ferrari and all of the other major marques. Don was big on that. It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the amount of fight in the dog. Yeah. And for a little boutique manufacturer that didn't have any of the capabilities and resources, but to go heads up with these major mainstream giants and occasionally get the better of them, that's what kept him going. And I think to his last days, that's what kept him going. Competing in the Pirelli World Challenge and having the success that they did, and he loved it. Even when he was not able to go to the races in the last days, I know he followed every minute of it.
I'm hoping we'll be able to sit down and capture some more at a future event, Scott, so there's no belief that we could capture your experiences with Don and your sharing Don with us in this way in one sit-down. Let's maybe, to close for this moment at least, what do you think in this early stage will be some of Don's, not just legacy on a personal level, the things he achieved, the trophies earned and such, maybe more impact? When you think about who he was, what he was, all that he touched, ways that he did things, just like when we lost Dan Gurney earlier this year, our friend Paul Fanner, who's sitting near us, one of the first, if not the first note he sent out to all of us was, we need to stop and think about how we can continue to live and represent all the things the Big Eagle was about, and trying to use to make the world a better place in his image. How do you think at this early stage, I know we just lost Don, there's similar areas, things that he did where you think, what kind of lasting impact might he have on us?
Yeah, the first example that comes to mind was his consistent and substantial support of having a for the fans mindset that permeated all of what we did. And Don used to get upset when he would ever think we were straying away from that. And if you recall, the very first American Le Mans Series logo had the phrase "for the fans" featured front and center.
Still have some at home.
Yeah, and that to me is a guiding principle that we use to this day. And I'm happy that there's a second, perhaps even a third generation of members of our team now that didn't work with Don, didn't have exposure to him in the American Le Mans Series, but have heard all about his accomplishments and his mindset. And even though we're a long ways away from the early days of For the Fans and the American Le Mans Series in its original vision, a lot of that still applies today. For me, on a more personal level, it was Don's consistent approach to business, which was to not be about investing in anything that didn't have substance behind it. In that you don't need the glass and marble entryway in order to have a functioning office. You don't need all of the bells and whistles in order to achieve the goal. And I'll give you one example that here's where Don, not coming from a motorsports background, didn't have the appreciation that perhaps others did for the fact that at the end of the day, there's a degree of show business involved here. And there is an expectation from fans when they come to the racetrack of what they're going to see. And the example that comes to my mind was we had just acquired a transporter, a truck and trailer rig, that was going to be our first kind of base of operation. And the tractor that had been purchased had white painted wheels. Very generic, very middle of the road, just, off the shelf, nothing that would say motorsports, nothing that suggests technology, nothing that has any amount of showmanship whatsoever.
In a paddock of polished everything.
Yeah, keep in mind that Dave Mirage was actively involved. Champion Racing was the Penske of our paddock at the time. Everything was completely polished, to the nth degree. So I get approached by our group that is responsible for operating the truck and says, hey, we've gone out and got some bids for aluminum wheels. And, here's what it's going to take to swap out these white painted steel wheels for the polished aluminum. Okay, great. Won't that make a better appearance and certainly make us consistent with what we're asking all of our teams to do, which is up their game. We want to have a really a paddock that speaks to the professionalism of what we're trying to organize here. So I go into Don and say, Don, and I forget the numbers, but let's just say it's $10,000 to swap out these wheels. And he looks at me and says, well, why would we want to do that? And I said, well, Don, we're in motorsports. This is racing. We got to look the part.
Yep.
He says, well, is the truck going to go down the road any better with these wheels? I said, no. Is it going to get better fuel mileage? No. So is there any performance advantage whatsoever to changing these wheels out? I don't think so. Well, why would we want to spend what you're telling me, this is purely for appearance. It's just for the look. I said, yeah, basically, you're right. Well, then no, I'm not doing it. So I think to this day, that truck and trailer rig still has white painted steel wheels. There was no option around it. And thankfully, some of the trucks and trailers we acquired, always used, by the way, but came with wheels that were a bit more appropriate for the purpose and the environment that we were operating in. But that mindset of how Don operated.
It wasn't opulence and grandeur and just...
No, it was
exact opposite.
You will have whatever you need to get the job done, period. If you want to add to it, that's up to you. Don't do it on my nickel. But, you're going to have what you need. And that applied to the race team. That applied to the business office. That applied to our staff. And it's a mindset.
But for someone who was not a racer, lifelong racer, someone coming in and naive, I don't know if he realized it or not, but that's a racer's mentality. We'll spend the money and invest in it if it's going to show up on the stopwatch. If it's going to make the pit crew finish that stop a second.
Yep.
But if you're talking spending money just for the sake of, that doesn't have that racer's purity. So I love the fact that at his core, Don was already there.
Don evolved to a degree.
Sure.
His programs were never going to be the high-profile carbon fiber and chrome look, but he did evolve over time, and he became a true enthusiast and well-versed on the industry. He was no one's fool. And as I say, there was an evolution that took place over 14 years there that by today's standards, looking back at the early days, there's very little in common. But that's just how things develop and grow, in any relationship, in any business. But the early days of trying to convince Don that we needed chrome wheels, that conversation was going nowhere.
There's a good lesson you picked up right there.
Yeah. Scott,
thank you for taking the time. And I know there are many who are grieving and will continue to, and I know that among those you are. This has been a huge loss for you. So I and I know my listeners greatly appreciate your willingness to sit down and share some good words and also some fun stories about Don.
I appreciate the opportunity. It hit me hard. John Hindhoff used the phrase yesterday, we both felt like we've lost our racing dad with the loss of Don, and I would agree with that. And ironically, both he and I lost our real dads, his more recently than mine last year, his just recently. So it's hit hard. And the one thing I would say to everybody that knew Don, he ran wide open right to the end. And I think he exited this world exactly the way he wanted. 2 weeks prior to him climbing into bed for the last time, he was on an airplane flying back from a business meeting. And at 83 years old, with the lifestyle that he led, I don't think anybody extracted more out of 83 years than Don Panoz. And that puts a smile on my face, and just knowing that he went out exactly the way he wanted.
Hoping we can sit down early next year, capture some more thoughts, some more stories, more memories and tales of Don Panoz and Scott Atherton's time with him for the better part of 14, 15 years. And thanks again to him for sitting down during a busy weekend, and also one where he was still grieving and definitely filled with heavy hearts at the loss of his good friend, I would say mentor, you name it, just someone that really played a huge, huge role in his world. All right, I'm Marshall Pruett. This is a Marshall Pruett podcast presented by Cooper Tires. Thank you so much for listening.